In the quiet of nature, as families enjoy the beauty of the wild, a massive grizzly bear suddenly emerges. It heads straight for a girl in a wheelchair, freezing the crowd in fear. Is this just a dangerous encounter, or is there something hidden behind the bear's gaze? Surely you have some interesting thoughts about this video. Please leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your opinions. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button to support the channel. No more waiting. The story begins right now. 12-year-old Emily Parker loved the outdoors. Despite her disability, which left her wheelchair-bound since the age of 6, she found joy and freedom in nature. Her parents, Sarah and John, made sure she never missed out, often taking her to Grand Teton National Park, a place where she could feel part of something vast and wild. On a warm summer afternoon, Emily sat near the edge of a small scenic clearing. Her parents were only a few steps away, chatting with a park ranger about nearby trails. Emily's golden retriever, Teddy, lay curled by her feet, his head resting on her lap. She was sketching in her notebook her favorite way to capture the beauty around her. Today it was a family of elk grazing in the distance. For Emily, the wheelchair wasn't a barrier, but a companion in her journey. Her parents often reminded her of her strength, but what she loved most was her connection with animals. She had a way of understanding them, sensing their emotions and finding peace in their presence. Suddenly, Buddy perked up. His ears stiffened, and a low, uncertain whine escaped his throat. Emily glanced at him. "What is it, Teddy?" she asked, her voice soft. She followed his gaze toward the tree line. At first, she didn't see anything, just the dense thicket of evergreens swaying slightly in the breeze. But then, she saw it, a shadow moving between the trees. A massive grizzly bear emerged into the clearing. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The bear's sheer size was awe-inspiring, its fur thick and golden brown glistening in the sunlight. The animal moved with a calm yet deliberate grace, its dark eyes scanning the area. Emily froze, her pencil slipping from her fingers. Buddy let out another whine, but didn't bark, as if he too understood the gravity of the moment. The other visitors noticed the bear almost simultaneously. A ripple of gasps and murmurs spread through the small crowd, followed by the sound of people retreating cautiously. Emily's parents turned sharply, their faces pale as they saw the bear heading toward their daughter. "Emily!" Sarah called out, her voice trembling. "Don't move!" But Emily couldn't move, not because of her wheelchair, but because something about the bear held her captive. Its eyes weren't menacing. They weren't even focused on the other people. They were locked onto her. The bear moved closer, each step measured and quiet. The clearing seemed to shrink, the sounds of the forest fading as everyone held their breath. John moved a step forward, but the ranger held up a hand, whispering urgently, "Don't, stay still." Any sudden movement could provoke it. Sarah's hands trembled as she whispered, "But that's my daughter." The ranger's face was grave. "I know, but trust me, she's safer if we don't startle it." Emily's pulse raced as the bear stopped just a few feet away from her. She could feel its presence, its immense power and weight, but she also felt something else, an odd sense of calm. The bear tilted its head, sniffing the air as it studied her. Buddy remained still, his body tense but unmoving, as if sensing Emily needed him to stay quiet. Emily's voice came out as a whisper. "It's okay," she said, though she wasn't sure if she was talking to the bear, herself, or Teddy. Slowly she raised her hand, palm up, as if to show she meant no harm. The bear took another step closer. Its eyes, deep and dark, seemed to hold a strange understanding. Emily felt tears welling in her own eyes, not from fear but from something she couldn't quite explain, a connection, fleeting yet profound. Behind her, Emily could hear her mother stifling a sob, her father muttering prayers under his breath. The other visitors had retreated entirely, some filming the moment from a distance, their phones shaking in their hands. But Emily wasn't aware of any of it. She was completely focused on the bear. "Are you lost?" she whispered, barely audible. The bear's ears twitched at the sound of her voice, and for a brief moment it lowered its head slightly, as if bowing. The gesture was so subtle, so unexpected, that it left Emily breathless. Then, just as calmly as it had approached, the bear turned and walked away. It moved back toward the tree line, where it paused for one last look before disappearing into the woods. The silence lingered for a few seconds before Emily's parents rushed to her side, wrapping her in their arms. "Are you okay?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "Did it hurt you?" Emily shook her head, her tears finally spilling over. "No," she said softly. "It didn't want to hurt me. It was just looking." The ranger exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "I've worked here for 15 years, he muttered. "I've never seen anything like that." The chapter closes as Emily looks down at her sketchbook. The drawing of the elk family she'd been working on was still unfinished, but now she felt compelled to start a new one, of the bear, the moment that would stay with her forever. The clearing had returned to a tense calm. The crowd, who had been silent during the encounter, began to murmur in disbelief. Parents pulled their children closer, some hurriedly walking toward the parking lot, their fear still palpable. A few stayed back, phones in hand, watching Emily as if trying to piece together what they had just witnessed. Emily remained in her wheelchair, her hands resting in her lap. The moment had passed, but the feeling lingered, a deep, almost sacred sense of connection. She wasn't sure if it was real, or if her mind had simply imagined the emotions in the bear's eyes, but she couldn't shake the thought that the animal had looked at her with something more than curiosity. "Emily, we're leaving," her father said firmly, his hands on her wheelchair handles. He didn't wait for her to respond, already guiding her toward the family's car. Buddy trotted alongside, his tail low but wagging slightly, as if sensing Emily's mixed emotions. "But what about the bear?" Emily asked, craning her neck to look back at the tree line. The spot where the grizzly had disappeared seemed to call out to her, begging her to stay. Her mother, walking beside her, placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. "Honey, we need to get you somewhere safe. That bear, it was wild. We can't take any chances." Emily didn't argue, but she couldn't let go of the thought that the bear hadn't meant any harm. It had approached her, stopped, and left without any sign of aggression. It didn't fit with the warnings she'd always heard about grizzlies. At the edge of the parking lot, the ranger approached the family. His name tag read David Wells, and his face was still pale from the encounter. "Mr. and Mrs. Parker," he began, his tone cautious. "I want to check in on Emily and make sure she's all right. That was an unusual situation." "She's fine," John said quickly, but Emily interrupted. "I'm fine, but I don't think the bear was going to hurt me." The adults exchanged nervous glances. David crouched slightly, meeting Emily's gaze. Bears, especially grizzlies, are unpredictable. It's rare for one to approach a human like that without showing aggression, but that doesn't mean it wasn't dangerous. "But it wasn't," Emily insisted, her voice steady. "It looked at me like it knew me, like it was sad." David hesitated, studying her face. He'd worked in the park for nearly a decade and had seen countless bear encounters, but this one was different. The bear hadn't acted like any he'd ever seen. It wasn't territorial or defensive. If anything, it seemed curious. He shook his head. "I don't know why it acted that way, but I'll file a report. We'll keep an eye on the area." That evening, Emily couldn't stop thinking about the bear. As her family drove back to their rented cabin near the park, she stared out the window, her thoughts racing. The bear's image replayed in her mind, the size of its frame, the softness in its eyes, and the way it had lowered its head slightly, almost like a bow. "Why do you think it came to me?" she asked suddenly, breaking the silence in the car. Her father glanced at her in the rearview mirror, his expression guarded. "It's just an animal, Emily. You were sitting still, and it probably didn't see you as a threat," her mother chimed in. "Your wheelchair might have confused it. Maybe it was curious." But Emily shook her head. "It wasn't confused. It felt like it was trying to tell me something." Her parents didn't respond, exchanging a worried glance instead. Emily turned back to the window, feeling frustrated. She wasn't a child anymore, and she knew what she felt. The bear wasn't just curious, it was deliberate. That night, as the family settled into the cabin, Emily stayed up late, sitting by the window with Buddy at her side. She sketched the bear from memory, her pencil strokes capturing every detail. Its broad shoulders, its intelligent eyes, and the way it had looked at her as though it carried a secret. Just as she was about to close her sketchbook, Buddy perked up again. He let out a low growl, staring at the darkness beyond the cabin. Emily froze, her heart pounding. She wheeled herself closer to the window and peered outside. In the faint moonlight, she saw movement near the tree line. Her breath caught as the familiar silhouette of the grizzly bear emerged, its shape unmistakable. It stood there for a moment, watching the cabin. Emily's heart raced, but she felt no fear. Instead, she felt a pull, a strange, unshakable sense that the bear had come back for her. She reached for her parents, calling out softly, "Mom? Dad?" But by the time they came to the window, the bear was gone. The next morning, the encounter at the cabin weighed heavily on Emily's mind. She hadn't told her parents about seeing the bear again. They had been so on edge the day before, and she didn't want to worry them any further. But deep down, she knew the bear had returned for a reason. As the family prepared to visit a different part of the park, Emily packed her sketchbook and pencils, as she always did. Her parents insisted on sticking to well-trodden trails, keeping close to other visitors to avoid any potential danger. But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she and the bear's paths weren't done crossing. The trail they chose that morning wound through a dense part of the forest, sunlight filtering through the tall pines. Emily felt the weight of the forest's silence pressing on her, interrupted only by the sound of Teddy's paws crunching softly on the dirt path and the occasional call of a bird. "Stay close," her dad called back as he led the way, his protective tone unmistakable. Her mother walked beside her, glancing at Emily frequently, as if ensuring the bear hadn't somehow followed them. But Emily's thoughts were elsewhere. Her mind replayed every detail of the bear's behavior, the calm way it had approached her, the way it seemed almost vulnerable. It wasn't like the fearsome creatures she'd seen in videos or read about in books. There was something more, something deeper. As the family rounded a bend in the trail, Emily noticed a faint path leading away from the main route. It was narrow, barely visible under a layer of pine needles and moss, and seemed to disappear into the thick trees. "What's over there?" she asked, pointing. Her mother glanced briefly at the path. Probably nothing. "Let's stick to the main trail." But Emily couldn't take her eyes off it. Something about the path called to her, a quiet tug in her chest that she couldn't ignore. "Can we check it out? Just for a minute?" John frowned. "No, Emily, we're staying where it's safe." She wanted to argue but bit her tongue. She couldn't explain it, but she felt as if the bear was out there, waiting for her. Buddy whined softly, his gaze fixed in the same direction as the faint trail. That afternoon, the family stopped for a picnic in a grassy meadow surrounded by towering evergreens. Emily sat slightly apart from her parents, sketching the trees and distant mountains. Buddy lay by her side, occasionally lifting his head to sniff the air. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, Emily felt a strange stillness settle over the meadow. The birds had gone quiet, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. She glanced up, her heart quickening, when she saw Teddy's ears perked. "Teddy, what is it?" she whispered. Then she saw it, a familiar shape moving through the trees on the edge of the meadow. The bear. It was the same Grizzly, unmistakably large and golden brown, moving with slow, deliberate steps. It stopped just at the edge of the clearing, its dark eyes locking onto Emily's once again. Her breath caught as the pull she'd felt earlier returned, stronger than ever. Emily knew she should call out to her parents, but she hesitated. The bear wasn't acting aggressively, it wasn't even moving closer. It just stood there, watching her with that same quiet intensity she had seen before. Slowly, she lifted her sketchbook, her pencil trembling slightly in her hand. She began to draw, capturing the bear's powerful frame and the way it seemed to blend with the shadows of the trees. It stood perfectly still, as if it knew she was sketching it, as if it wanted her to remember this moment. Buddy stayed by her side, quiet but alert, his tail wagging faintly as if he too understood that this was no ordinary encounter. Emily glanced over her shoulder. Her parents were still chatting, oblivious to the bear's presence. She turned back to the animal, feeling a wave of gratitude for the way it stayed at a distance, respecting her space while still making its presence known. After what felt like an eternity, the bear let out a low huff, its breath visible in the cool afternoon air. Then it turned and disappeared back into the forest, its movements as graceful as they were powerful. When her parents called her back to the picnic blanket, Emily debated whether to tell them what had just happened. They had been so insistent on keeping her safe, so worried about the bear being a threat. But Emily didn't see the grizzly as dangerous. She saw it as something else, a guardian perhaps, or maybe a messenger. "You okay, sweetheart?" her mom asked, noticing the distant look on Emily's face. "Yeah," Emily said softly, tucking her sketchbook under her arm. "I'm fine." That night back at the cabin, Emily couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind filled with questions. Why had the bear approached her again? What was it trying to tell her? And why did she feel so connected to it? She reached for her sketchbook and flipped to the drawing she'd done earlier. The bear's eyes stared back at her from the page, and for a moment, she felt as if she could hear its heartbeat. Whatever this connection was, she knew it wasn't over. The chapter ends with Emily falling asleep, her sketchbook clutched tightly to her chest as the faint sound of a bear's huff echoes in the distance. The next morning dawned bright and clear, but Emily woke with a sense of restlessness. Her parents were bustling around the cabin, making breakfast and preparing for another day of exploring the park. Emily, however, couldn't stop thinking about the bear. The encounters felt less like coincidence and more like a message, though she had no idea what it could mean. While eating breakfast, Emily finally spoke up. "I want to go back to the meadow," she said, her voice steady. Her mother glanced at her, startled. "Why? We were there all day yesterday. I feel like I need to," Emily said, struggling to put her feelings into words. "There's something about that place." John set down his coffee cup with a sigh. "Emily, we've already talked about this. You need to stay on the main trails. It's too dangerous to go wandering off." Emily bit her lip, feeling frustration bubble up inside her. "I'm not wandering off. I just want to go back to the same place we were." "Please?" Her parents exchanged a look. Finally, Sarah relented. "Okay," she said softly. "We'll go back, but we're staying together this time." Later that morning, the family returned to the same meadow, the sunlight casting long golden rays across the grass. Emily felt her pulse quicken as they arrived. She scanned the tree line, half expecting to see the bear waiting for her. But the clearing was empty, save for a few grazing deer. Her parents laid out a blanket and began unpacking their lunch, but Emily couldn't sit still. She wheeled herself a few feet away, her eyes fixed on the edge of the forest. Buddy stayed by her side, his tail wagging faintly as if he too was anticipating something. "Emily, don't wander too far," her father called, his tone wary. "I won't," she replied, though her attention was elsewhere. She pulled out her sketchbook, hoping that drawing would calm her nerves. As her pencil glided across the page, she heard it, a faint rustling in the trees. She froze, her heart pounding. Slowly, she turned her head, and there it was. The bear. It stood just inside the tree line, partially hidden by the shadows. Its dark eyes locked onto Emily, and once again she felt that unexplainable pull. The bear stepped forward, its massive paws crunching softly on the grass. Buddy let out a low whine, but Emily placed a hand on his head to calm him. Her parents hadn't noticed yet, their backs turned as they unpacked their lunch. Emily's throat tightened. She knew she should call out to them, but something held her back. She felt like this moment was meant for her and the bear alone. Gathering her courage, Emily placed her sketchbook in her lap and wheeled herself a few feet closer to the bear. The animal stopped, watching her with what could only be described as curiosity. It wasn't the aggressive stance she'd read about in books or seen in documentaries. This bear wasn't threatening her, it was communicating. "You came back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Why?" The bear tilted its head slightly, as if considering her question. Then, to Emily's astonishment, it lowered itself onto the grass, sitting back on its haunches. It was a gesture of trust, one that took her breath away. Emily felt tears prick her eyes. She reached for her sketchbook, flipping to a fresh page. "Can I draw you?" she asked softly, though she didn't expect an answer. The bear didn't move, its gaze steady as Emily began to sketch. Her hands trembled slightly, but she focused on capturing every detail. The thickness of its fur, the power in its massive frame, and the intelligence in its eyes. She felt as though the bear was allowing her to see into its soul. Just as Emily finished her sketch, She heard a sharp gasp behind her. She turned to see her mother standing frozen, her eyes wide with fear as she stared at the bear. "Emily!" Sarah's voice was frantic. "Get back here now!" The bear stood abruptly, sensing the tension in the air. Emily's heart sank as she saw its calm demeanor shift. It let out a low growl, not of aggression, but of warning. "Mom, stop!" Emily called, her voice desperate. "It's okay. It's not going to hurt me." But Sarah wasn't listening. She grabbed John, who had just noticed the bear, and they both moved toward Emily, their panic palpable. The bear backed away, its eyes darting between Emily and her parents. It let out another huff before retreating into the trees. Within seconds, it was gone, leaving Emily feeling hollow. Her parents reached her, their faces pale. "What were you thinking?" John demanded, his voice shaking. "That's a wild animal, Emily. It could have killed you." "It wasn't going to hurt me," Emily said, her voice cracking. "You don't understand." "Then explain it to us," Sarah said, her tone sharp with fear and frustration. "What's going on, Emily? Why do you keep acting like this bear is something more?" Emily looked down at her sketchbook, her tears falling onto the page. "Because it is," she whispered. "I don't know how to explain it, but it's trying to tell me something." Her parents didn't respond. They simply stood there, their faces a mix of confusion and worry, as Emily clutched her sketchbook to her chest, wondering if she would ever see the bear again. The atmosphere at the cabin that evening was tense. Emily's parents were unusually quiet, their worried glances at her saying everything they didn't speak aloud. Emily, however, was consumed by thoughts of the bear. Why had it come back again? Why did she feel such a powerful connection to it? Buddy rested by her feet, his calm presence grounding her as she flipped through her sketchbook. Each drawing of the bear felt like a piece of a puzzle she was trying to solve. It wasn't just an animal to her anymore. It was a messenger, though what it was trying to tell her remained a mystery. "Emily," her mother's voice broke the silence. She sat down across from Emily, her hands clasped tightly together. "We need to talk." Emily looked up, her chest tightening. "About the bear?" Her father sat down beside her mother, his face lined with concern. "Yes, about the bear and about something we haven't told you." Emily furrowed her brow, confused. "What do you mean?" Her mother took a deep breath, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "When you were a baby, we lived in Montana. Your dad worked as a park ranger, and we spent a lot of time in the wilderness." Emily nodded, unsure where this was going. One day, her father continued, "We were out hiking with you in a baby carrier. You were just a few months old. We didn't see the grizzly until it was too late. It came out of nowhere." Emily's breath caught. "A grizzly?" Her mother nodded, her voice trembling. "Your dad and I froze. We thought it was over, that the bear was going to attack. But it didn't." "What happened?" Emily asked, leaning forward. "The bear came right up to us," her father said. "It was huge, scarred, and old. But instead of hurting us, it sniffed you. Just you. Then it let out this low sound, almost like a sigh, and walked away." "We've never forgotten it." Emily stared at them, her mind reeling. "Why didn't you tell me this before?" "We didn't think it mattered anymore," her mother said, "and we didn't want to scare you. But now, seeing how this bear keeps approaching you, we think it might be connected." Emily shook her head, struggling to process the revelation. "You're saying this bear might be the same one? That it remembers me?" Her father shrugged helplessly. "We don't know, but bears are intelligent. They have strong memories." "It's possible." Emily sat back, her heart pounding. The story made sense in a way that sent chills down her spine. The bear's calm demeanor, the way it looked at her with those deep, knowing eyes. It was as if it recognized her. Later that night, as Emily lay in bed, she couldn't sleep. The weight of her parents' story pressed heavily on her mind. If this bear was truly the same one, why had it come back now? What was it trying to communicate? She stared out the window, the moonlight casting shadows across the forest. A sudden wild idea took hold of her. What if she went back to the meadow alone? What if she could face the bear without her parents' fear holding her back? The thought terrified her, but it also filled her with a strange sense of purpose. She needed answers. and the only way to get them was to follow her instincts. The next morning, Emily told her parents she wasn't feeling well and wanted to stay at the cabin. Reluctantly, they agreed, leaving her behind with Buddy while they went out for a short hike. As soon as the door closed behind them, Emily grabbed her sketchbook, strapped Teddy's leash to his collar, and wheeled herself toward the trail. Her heart raced as she retraced the path to the meadow, her pulse pounding in her ears. Buddy stayed close, his tail wagging as if he sensed her determination. When she reached the clearing, the sight of the empty meadow made her stomach twist with disappointment. She scanned the tree line, hoping, praying for a sign. "Please," she whispered, "if you're out there, come back." For a long moment, nothing happened. The forest was silent, the wind rustling softly through the trees. Emily's shoulders sagged. Maybe she'd been wrong. Maybe the bear was gone for good. But then she heard it, a low, familiar huff. Emily's heart leapt as the grizzly bear stepped out from the shadows, its massive frame illuminated by the dappled sunlight. It moved slowly, deliberately, its dark eyes fixed on her. This time there was no fear. Emily felt an overwhelming wave of calm as the bear approached, stopping just a few feet away. It lowered itself onto the grass, mirroring the gesture it had made the day before. "Why are you here?" Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "What are you trying to tell me?" The bear didn't respond, of course, but its presence was enough. Emily opened her sketchbook and began to draw, her hands steady as she captured the bear's likeness. She felt as though the act of drawing it brought them closer, as if she were preserving the connection they shared. When she finished, the bear stood and turned toward the forest. It paused at the tree line, glancing back at her one last time before disappearing into the shadows. Emily felt tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. The bear wasn't just a wild animal, it was a part of her story, and she was a part of its. The chapter ends with Emily wheeling herself back to the cabin, her sketchbook clutched tightly in her lap, and a new sense of purpose burning in her chest. Emily returned to the cabin just as her parents arrived back from their hike. Her heart raced as she hid her sketchbook under her blanket, unsure how to explain what she had done. She felt guilty for sneaking away, but at the same time, she couldn't shake the feeling that what had happened in the meadow was meant to be. Sarah noticed the flush in Emily's cheeks and asked, "Are you feeling better, sweetheart? You look like you've been up and about." "I'm fine," Emily said quickly. "Just rested and spent some time drawing." Her mother smiled, oblivious to the truth, but Emily's father narrowed his eyes slightly, as though sensing something was amiss. He didn't say anything, though, and Emily was grateful for it. That evening, as the family sat around the fireplace in the cozy cabin, Emily's thoughts remained on the bear. What was it about her that drew the animal to her? Why had it looked at her with such trust, as though they shared an unspoken bond? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sound that sent chills down her spine, a low, deep growl from outside the cabin. Buddy leaped to his feet, barking furiously as Emily's parents froze. John reached for a flashlight and motioned for everyone to stay back. "Stay here, I'll check it out." "No," Emily blurted, panic rising in her chest. "It's not what you think." Her parents looked at her, confused. "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. Before Emily could explain, the growl came again, this time followed by a soft huffing sound. Emily knew that sound. Her heart leapt. "It's the bear," she whispered. John's face darkened. "The bear? How do you know that?" I just do," Emily said, her voice trembling. "It's not here to hurt us. Please don't scare it away." Ignoring her plea, John moved to the window and peered out. What he saw made him gasp. The massive grizzly was standing just outside the cabin, its broad shoulders illuminated by the porch light. Behind it, the shadows of 3 cubs were barely visible in the darkness. "It has cubs," John whispered, his voice a mix of fear and astonishment. "It's not alone." Sarah clutched Emily's hand, her face pale. "John, we can't stay here. We have to call someone." "No," Emily said again, more forcefully this time. "You don't understand. It's not dangerous." "Emily, it's a wild animal," her father said, his tone firm. "We can't take that chance." Emily's frustration boiled over. "You don't get it," she shouted. It's not here to hurt us. It's here for me." Her parents stared at her, stunned by her outburst. Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. "I've seen it before. I went back to the meadow today, and it came to me. It sat with me. It let me draw it. It's not just a bear. It's trying to tell me something." John shook his head, his disbelief evident. "Emily, that's—" "Let me show you," Emily interrupted. She wheeled herself to her bed and retrieved her sketchbook, flipping to the pages where she had drawn the bear. She held it up, her hands trembling. "Look!" Her parents leaned in, their expressions softening as they took in the detailed sketches. The bear's eyes, its posture, the emotion captured in the lines. All of it was there. Sarah's hand covered her mouth as tears welled in her eyes. "Emily," she whispered, "this is—" Before she could finish, there was a loud thump at the door. The family turned to see the silhouette of the bear, its massive frame filling the doorway. It wasn't growling or pacing, just standing there as though waiting. John reached for his phone, but Emily stopped him. "Please," she begged, tears streaming down her face. "Don't call anyone. Just let me go to it." "Absolutely not," her father said. "It's too dangerous." "It trusts me," Emily said, "and I trust it." Sarah placed a hand on John's arm, her expression conflicted. "John, maybe we should listen to her. This is different." John hesitated, torn between his protective instincts and the inexplicable moment unfolding before him. Finally, he sighed. "I'm coming with you," he said firmly. "No sudden movements," Emily said, her voice steady despite the fear racing through her veins. With her father by her side, Emily wheeled herself to the door. She opened it slowly, the cold night air rushing in. The bear stood just a few feet away, its dark eyes meeting hers. Behind it, the cubs peered out curiously, their small forms barely visible. The bear let out a low huff, its breath misting in the chilly air. Emily extended her hand, palm up, as she had done in the meadow. "It's okay," she said softly. "I'm here." To everyone's astonishment, the bear stepped closer. It lowered its massive head, sniffing the air near Emily's hand. The cubs crept forward cautiously, their tiny paws crunching in the snow. John held his breath, his entire body tense. But Emily felt calm, her heart swelling with a mix of awe and gratitude. She couldn't explain it, but she knew this was a moment of trust, one that transcended the boundaries between human and animal. For several minutes, the family stood in silence, watching as Emily and the bear shared an unspoken connection. Finally, the bear let out one last huff, nudged one of its cubs forward, and then turned to leave. The cubs followed, their small forms disappearing into the darkness. As the door closed behind them, Emily turned to her parents, tears streaming down her face. "Do you believe me now?" Her father knelt beside her, his own eyes misty. "I do," he said softly. "I don't understand it, but I believe you." The chapter ends with Emily holding her sketchbook tightly, knowing that this was only the beginning of a story she would carry for the rest of her life. The night after the bear's visit, the cabin was quiet. Emily sat by the fireplace, her sketchbook resting on her lap, staring at the blank page in front of her. She felt a strange mix of emotions, gratitude, awe, and an unshakable sense of loss. Though the bear and her cubs had left, their presence lingered like a fading echo. Her parents, and still processing what had happened, sat nearby. For the first time, there was no argument, no insistence that the bear was just a wild animal. The look in their eyes mirrored her own, a quiet acceptance that something extraordinary had taken place. "I don't know how to explain it," Sarah said softly, breaking the silence. "But when I saw the way it looked at you, it didn't feel like an accident. It felt like it knew you." John nodded slowly, his usual skepticism softened. "It's not something I ever thought I'd see. A grizzly bear with cubs no less, trusting a human like that. It's not natural, but maybe that's the point." Emily smiled faintly, her fingers tracing the edges of her sketchbook. "It wasn't just about trust," she said quietly. "It was like it was trying to remind me of something bigger." The next morning, Emily asked her parents if they could visit the meadow one last time before heading home. They hesitated but ultimately agreed, sensing how much it meant to her. When they arrived, the clearing was bathed in golden sunlight. The grass swayed gently in the breeze, and the faint sounds of birds filled the air. It was peaceful, yet Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. She wheeled herself to the edge of the tree line, Buddy trotting faithfully at her side. Her parents stayed back, giving her space. Emily closed her eyes, letting the sounds of the forest wash over her. "If you're still out there," she whispered, "thank you for everything." When she opened her eyes, there was no sign of the bear or her cubs. But Emily didn't feel disappointed. She felt at peace. She pulled out her sketchbook and began to draw, her pencil moving effortlessly as she captured the spirit of the bear one last time. Back at home, Emily couldn't stop thinking about the encounter. She began sharing her sketches and her story with friends, who were captivated by the connection she described. Word spread, and soon a local wildlife conservation group reached out to her. "We'd love for you to speak at one of our events," the group's coordinator said during a phone call. "Your story is exactly what we need to inspire people to care about these animals." At first, Emily hesitated. She wasn't sure if she was ready to share something so personal, but then she thought of the bear, standing silently in the meadow, trusting her in a way no one else had. This was her chance to honor that trust. Her parents supported her decision wholeheartedly. "You have a gift, Emily," Sarah said, "not just with your art, but with the way you see the world. People need to hear this." Months later, Emily stood in front of a crowded room, her sketchbook open on a podium. She had never spoken in public before, but as she looked out at the audience, she felt a calmness settle over her. She shared the story of the bear, her sketches projected on a screen behind her. "These animals are more than just part of the wilderness," she said, her voice steady. "They remind us of who we are, of our connection to something bigger than ourselves. They teach us about trust, resilience, and compassion. That bear trusted me, and now I want to do everything I can to protect her and others like her." The room erupted in applause as Emily finished. People approached her afterward, moved by her words and eager to support conservation efforts. She realized that her story, once just a personal memory, had become a powerful force for change. One quiet evening, months after the speech, Emily sat on the porch of her family's home, sketching as the sun dipped below the horizon. Buddy lay at her feet, his tail wagging lazily. She thought about the bear often, wondering where she and her cubs were now, if they were safe, if they remembered her. As she looked out at the darkening woods, she smiled. She didn't need to see the bear again to feel her presence. It was in the pages of her sketchbook, in the stories she shared, and in the quiet strength she carried with her every day. The chapter ends with Emily closing her sketchbook and looking up at the stars. "Thank you," she whispered, knowing that the bond she shared with the bear would stay with her forever. The story of the massive grizzly bear and the girl in the wheelchair isn't just an encounter between humans and nature. It's a powerful lesson in connection, trust, and compassion that transcends all boundaries. It makes us reflect on how we perceive and treat wildlife, and how sometimes there are moments in life that cannot be explained by logic, but are deeply felt with the heart. This story proves that there are special connections in this world that not everyone can understand or feel. If you felt moved by this story, don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you won't miss out on more inspiring and meaningful stories. We're committed to bringing you tales that enrich your soul and expand your perspective on the world around you. Thank you for watching, and please share this video with your friends and family if you think they will love these amazing stories. Let's explore, learn, and spread positive values together.